We've discussed it. You're no longer welcome in this house. My mother sent that in a text at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in the elevator at work, still holding my travel mug, watching the doors close. I read it twice. Then a second notification came through. My brother had liked the message with a thumbs up. Not a phone call, not even a conversation. A text message and a thumbs up emoji, and just like that, 28 years of being their daughter was apparently over. I stepped off on the 4th floor and walked to my desk at the accounting firm where I'd worked for 6 years. I set down my coffee. I opened my laptop. My hands were steady, which surprised me. But I'd been trained for this kind of steadiness, just not in the way most people are. When you spend years being the financial backstop for a family that treats you like a service rather than a person, you learn how to process a crisis without flinching. I pulled up the spreadsheet I kept for our family's shared accounts. There were 11 of them. My mother's cell phone plan, which I'd been paying since my father left. My grandmother's supplemental prescription coverage through a private insurer, $218 a month, automatically billed to my Visa. The Netflix and Crave accounts that my brother and his wife used every single night. The iCloud storage upgrade for my mother's phone. The home internet at the house in Mississauga where I grew up and hadn't lived in 4 years. I didn't cancel anything. That would send notifications, emails, automatic alerts. Instead, I opened each account one by one and removed my payment method. I replaced nothing. I just left the fields blank and saved the changes. The prescriptions would lapse quietly. The cell plan would suspend itself in 30 days when the next billing cycle hit and found nothing on file. The internet would cut out mid-month. No warning letters. No emails. Just silence, and then suddenly nothing working. My grandmother's coverage I left alone. That one I moved to a new policy under her name only with her listed as account holder. She didn't know yet, but she would. She'd get a letter explaining the transfer and the new login. I'd already arranged it the week before, when I'd started to feel the walls closing in. I'm not cruel. I just stopped being the only person holding the ceiling up. I closed the laptop and finished my coffee. I had a client meeting at 9 and the quarterly audit to finish by Friday. Life continued. That was the thing they never counted on, that I had a life entirely separate from the role they'd assigned me. Let me explain what that role actually was. When my father left, I was 19 and in my first year at the University of Toronto studying accounting. My mother called me the night he moved out and said she needed me home for the weekend. That weekend became a month. That month became the reason I nearly failed second year. I didn't fail. I pulled my grades up through sheer stubbornness and a lot of nights studying in the campus library until they locked the doors. But I did it alone, and I paid for it alone. My OSAP covered tuition. I worked at a grocery store and later a tax prep office to cover rent on a basement apartment in Scarborough. My mother told the neighbors I'd taken a gap year to help the family through a hard time. She left out the part where she'd also borrowed $4,000 from me to cover the mortgage that winter and never mentioned it again. After I graduated and got my CPA designation, things changed. Specifically, the amount of money my family expected from me changed. It was never asked directly. It was always framed as temporary, or as something any good daughter would do without making a fuss about it. When my brother got laid off from his sales job, my mother called me and explained that he and his wife were struggling with their car payments. Could I help? Just for a couple of months? Those 2 months stretched into 14. I transferred $700 every month to an account my mother held. I stopped counting after the first year because the number made me feel sick. When my grandmother's doctor recommended a private physiotherapy program after her hip replacement, the provincial coverage only went so far. Someone needed to bridge the gap. I know who that someone was because my mother told me in the same breath that my brother couldn't afford it right now. He'd just bought a new truck. The number I eventually added up, one slow Sunday afternoon with a glass of wine and a very uncomfortable spreadsheet, was $61,000 over 6 years. That's not counting the subscription accounts of the grocery runs I did every second week when I visited, or the birthday and Christmas gifts I bought for my brother's kids, because his wife texted me their wish lists every year in October, and my mother would have made the holidays unbearable if I hadn't come through. $61,000, more than my first 2 years' salary combined. Not one thank you that I can remember clearly. What I remember clearly is my mother telling my aunt at Thanksgiving that I'd been lucky with money. Like, financial stability was something that had happened to me rather than something I'd worked 90-hour weeks to build. The text that morning wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the morning they finally said out loud what the dynamic had always been. The story behind it was my cousin's wedding. My mother wanted me to contribute $3,000 to a family gift, a piece of custom furniture the extended family was pooling together for. I said I couldn't do it that month. I had just put $8,000 down on a condo in Hamilton, and my finances were stretched. She told me I was being selfish. I told her I'd been carrying the family's expenses for 6 years and I needed a month where I prioritized my own life. She hung up. That was a Thursday. The text came the following Tuesday. The morning after the text, my phone lit up before I'd even made coffee. 9 missed calls from my mother. 4 from my brother. A voicemail from my brother that started with the words, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" and went on for 4 minutes. I listened to about 45 seconds of it before I put my phone face down on the counter and made my coffee first. I called my lawyer before I called anyone in my family. Her name is on a plaque outside an office on King Street West, and she charges $350 an hour, and she is worth every cent. I'd set up a consultation with her the previous week, after the argument with my mother and before the text, because something in my gut had told me I needed to be prepared. I told her everything. The $61,000. The accounts. The text. The voicemail. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. "Save the voicemail," she said. "Don't delete anything." I also called my grandmother that morning, not to tell her about any of it. She didn't need to be in the middle of this, but because I genuinely wanted to hear her voice. She picked up on the second ring, which she always does because she keeps her phone in her cardigan pocket. She asked if I'd eaten breakfast. I said yes, which was a lie, but a kind one. She told me she'd gotten a letter about her prescription coverage and was confused. I told her I'd come by on Saturday and help her sort it out. "You're a good girl," she said. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just held the phone and listened to the sound of her television in the background. My brother called again at noon. I let it go to voicemail. At 2 p.m. he sent a text. "Mom's internet isn't working and she can't reach anyone at the phone company. What did you do?" I noticed he didn't put a question mark. I didn't respond. At 4 p.m., my mother sent a separate text. "The pharmacist says your grandmother's prescription isn't covered." She was very upset. "I hope you're happy with yourself." I had already transferred the new policy documents to my grandmother's email and written her the clearest instructions I could for how to call and confirm coverage. Her prescriptions were fully covered. My mother either hadn't checked or had decided a distressed grandmother made a better message than an informed one. I screenshotted everything and sent it to my lawyer. What I hadn't told anyone yet, what I was still processing myself, was the phone call I'd received 3 days before the wedding argument. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. It turned out to be the office of a solicitor in Oakville, calling on behalf of my grandfather's estate. My grandfather had passed away 4 months earlier, quietly, in a long-term care home where he'd lived for 2 years. My mother had told me he wasn't up for visitors. She told me the same thing for 24 months, which I should have questioned more. The solicitor, a calm, methodical man who sounded like he'd delivered this kind of news many times, told me that my grandfather had updated his will 18 months prior. There was a registered investment account, a small property outside of Guelph, and a cash savings account. The total value is approximately $340,000. My grandfather had left it entirely to me. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen when he said that. Just sat down, right there on the tile. My mother and my uncle had apparently already been informed. The solicitor told me carefully that there had been some initial dispute regarding the validity of the updated will. My grandfather had included a clause, added at his own request and witnessed by 2 people outside the family, stating that any challenge to the will by a named beneficiary would result in that beneficiary forfeiting their portion. My mother and uncle had been left modest amounts. By challenging, they would lose even those. That explained the texts. That explained everything. They hadn't disowned me because I'd said no to contributing to a wedding gift. They'd disowned me because they'd found out about the will and decided that if they couldn't have the inheritance, they were going to make my life difficult enough that I'd either hand over money voluntarily or be too destabilized to deal with the legal process clearly. It was a strategy. A bad one, but a strategy. I called the solicitor back and confirmed I would proceed with accepting the estate. I asked him how quickly the transfer could be finalized. He said 6 to 8 weeks if there were no further complications. I asked what counted as a complication. He said a formal legal challenge. I asked whether a series of hostile text messages counted. He said no. I went to my grandmother's on Saturday as promised. She lives in a ground floor apartment in a seniors building in Burlington, and she always has a pot of tea ready. I helped her set up the new insurance portal on her tablet, walked her through where to find her policy number, and wrote the phone number for the benefits line on a notepad she keeps by the phone. She asked me if everything was all right with my mother. I said we were having a disagreement. She nodded and poured more tea, and said, "Your grandfather always said she was hard to love when she was scared." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. The will reading was scheduled for a Wednesday. My mother and my uncle had to be present for the formal reading, which the solicitor had explained was standard for contested situations. I knew they'd be there. I dressed carefully, not to impress but to be precise. A plain blazer, dark trousers, flat shoes. Nothing that could be read as aggressive or defensive. I wanted to look like someone who had simply shown up prepared. The solicitor's office was on a quiet street in Oakville, the kind with parking meters and a small coffee shop on the corner. I arrived 10 minutes early. My mother and uncle were already in the waiting room. My brother was there too, which surprised me. My mother had brought reinforcements. She looked at me when I walked in and said, "I assume you've come to do the right thing." I sat down across from her. I didn't answer. The solicitor came out and led us into a boardroom with a long table and a window that looked onto a courtyard with a struggling maple tree. He went through the documents methodically. The property, the RIF account which had already been transferred to my name as the named beneficiary, bypassing the estate entirely, something my mother clearly hadn't accounted for. The savings account. The total. My uncle started talking before the solicitor finished. He said my grandfather had been confused in his final years, that the update to the will had been made under influence, that my mother had been the one visiting regularly, taking care of things, and that this outcome was fundamentally unjust. I watched my mother while he talked. Her jaw was tight. She was doing calculations. The solicitor let my uncle finish and then explained, for what I understood was not the first time, the clause regarding challenges. He asked directly whether my uncle intended to file a formal challenge. My uncle said he was considering it. The solicitor said that was his right, and reminded him of the conditions. My mother turned to me. "This isn't what Grandpa would have wanted," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the effort that took. "You know it isn't. You should do the right thing here." I had spent a long time preparing what I wanted to say, not rehearsing it exactly. I don't work that way, but sitting with the truth of it until it felt solid. "He updated his will 18 months ago," I said. "He was assessed by 2 independent witnesses. He knew what he was doing." I paused. I think he saw exactly what he was doing. My mother's expression didn't change, but her hands moved in her lap. My uncle said they would be consulting their own lawyer. The solicitor said that was, again, their right. We were done in 40 minutes. I shook the solicitor's hand and walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car for a while, before I drove anywhere, just breathing. The formal challenge never came. I don't know exactly what their lawyer told them, but the clause was airtight and the assessment documents were thorough, and I think at some point someone with better judgment than my uncle explained the math clearly enough that they let it go. The property outside Guelph was a small house on 2 acres that my grandfather had bought in the late 80s and rented out for years. The current tenants were a couple who'd been there for 11 years and treated the place with obvious care. I called them the week after the estate transferred and introduced myself. They were relieved, which told me everything about what the previous months of uncertainty had been like for them. I told them I wasn't planning to sell and that the rent arrangement would remain the same. The woman on the other end of the phone said, "Thank you. We weren't sure what was going to happen." I told her neither was I, honestly. The RIF and the savings account combined gave me the down payment for a better condo than the one I'd been stretching for in Hamilton, and a cushion I hadn't had since before I started quietly funding my family's life. I put the remainder in a TFSA. I set up an automatic transfer for a small amount every month to an account I opened specifically for my grandmother, for anything she needs that her pension doesn't cover. My mother has not contacted me since the meeting in Oakville, which is now 4 months ago. My brother texted me twice in the first month, once to say he hoped I was happy with myself, and once to ask if I could help with something I no longer remember. I didn't respond to either. The subscriptions have lapsed. The phone plan suspended, then terminated. I assume they sorted it out. I stopped assuming I was responsible for sorting things out for them. What I think about sometimes is my grandfather updating that will 18 months before he died. He did it quietly, on his own initiative, with his own lawyer and 2 witnesses who had no connection to any of us. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell anyone in the family who might have talked. He just did it, and he trusted that it would find me when it needed to. I don't know everything he saw from that care home in those last 2 years. I know he saw who came to visit and who didn't. I know he had enough clarity to make a legal decision that required 2 witnesses and a formal assessment. I know he'd watched me for 28 years, and I know what he decided. The last time I saw him, really saw him, before my mother started running interference, he was sitting in the common room of the care home playing cards with a man he'd befriended there. He looked up when I came in, and his whole face changed, just lit up, like I'd walked in with good news. I've been going through some of his things slowly, in my own time. There was a card in the drawer of his bedside table, still in its envelope, with my name on the front in his handwriting. He'd written it years ago by the look of the yellowing. Inside it said, "You were always the one who showed up. Don't let anyone convince you that's a weakness." I folded it back along its original crease and put it in the drawer of my own bedside table. Some things you keep, the rest you let the bank take back. There's a card in my bedside drawer now that I reread sometimes when I'm not sure I made the right calls. My grandfather wrote it years before he died, before any of this happened, and the line that stays with me is, "You were always the one who showed up. Don't let anyone convince you that's a weakness." He saw something in me that I spent a long time not seeing in myself. That gap between who you actually are and who your family has decided you are. That's where a lot of damage gets done quietly. I think about the $61,000 sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, mostly with clarity. That money didn't disappear. It bought me something I couldn't have gotten any other way. The absolute certainty that I had done everything right, and that what happened anyway had nothing to do with my effort or my love. You can't be gaslit about your own generosity when you've kept the receipts. That's not pettiness. That's just honesty with yourself. What I've come to understand is that the people who took from me weren't cruel in a calculated way. They were scared, and they built a structure where my stability made their instability invisible. My mother didn't have to reckon with her choices as long as I was there absorbing the consequences. My brother didn't have to grow up as long as I was there to catch him. Taking away the safety net didn't punish them. It just stopped protecting them from themselves. There's a difference. I had to sit with that difference for a while before I felt clean about it. The thing about integrity, about actually living by your values instead of just performing them, is that it's slow. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. Paying that $61,000 over 6 years didn't feel like strength. It felt like obligation, like fear, like not wanting to be the one who let the family fall apart. But it was, underneath all of that, a choice I kept making. And eventually, I made a different choice. That shift didn't happen because I got angry. It happened because I got honest. My grandfather was the same way. He didn't make a dramatic gesture. He didn't confront anyone. He just sat quietly in a care home and thought carefully about what he'd observed, and then he acted with precision. He updated a document with 2 witnesses and a clear mind. That's not revenge. That's integrity expressed through paperwork. There's something almost funny about that, and also something I find genuinely moving. I'm not the same person I was the morning I got that text. Something about being told you're no longer family, even by people you'd started to grieve long before the words were written, changes the shape of things. It clarified what I owe people and what I don't. It reminded me that showing up, paying attention, and building something real are not weaknesses to be exploited. They are, in fact, the whole point. The condo is good. The TFSA is growing. My grandmother calls on Sundays and always asks if I've eaten. I always say yes. Sometimes it's even true. Some things you keep, the rest you let go, not because you've stopped caring, but because you finally care about yourself enough to know the difference.